In 845, the Vikings, led by Ragnar Lothbrok, launched a daring siege on Paris, marking a turning point in European history. As Viking longships sailed down the Seine, they struck fear into the heart of King Charles the Bald, who struggled to defend his realm. The siege wasn't just a battle, it was a clash of cultures and military strategies. Ragnar's bold tactics showcased Viking adaptability, while Charles faced the challenge of defending a fractured empire. Despite fierce resistance, Paris fell, forcing Charles to pay a massive ransom to save his city. This moment shook the Frankish kingdom and showed that even the greatest empires could be brought to their knees by agile, unconventional forces. The Siege of Paris marked a new era, where Viking raids would forever reshape the political and cultural landscape of Europe.
In the year 845, the unthinkable happened. The city of Paris, the heart of the Frankish Empire, faced an onslaught from a feared and relentless enemy, the Vikings. Led by the legendary chieftain Ragnar Lothbrok, the Norsemen descended on the city, leaving devastation in their wake. This is the story of the Siege of Paris, where brute force, diplomacy, and terror collided on the banks of the Seine. The Vikings, seafaring warriors from Scandinavia, had long terrorized the coasts of Europe, raiding monasteries and towns in their search for wealth and glory. But in 845, they set their sights on something far more ambitious: the wealthy and fortified city of Paris. A fleet of 120 longships, led by Ragnar Lothbrok, sailed up the Seine, intent on sacking the Frankish capital. The Vikings, seafaring warriors from Scandinavia, had long terrorized the coasts of Europe, raiding monasteries and towns in their search for wealth and glory. But in 845, they set their sights on something far more ambitious: the wealthy and fortified city of Paris. A fleet of 120 longships, led by Ragnar Lothbrok, sailed up the Seine, intent on sacking the Frankish capital. Ragnar Lothbrok, already a legendary figure in Viking lore, sought to prove his might against one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. As his fleet advanced along the Seine, they struck fear into the hearts of the Franks. Emperor Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, was desperate to defend his kingdom, but the Viking threat loomed ever closer. Paris, a city of strategic importance, was heavily fortified with walls and surrounded by the protective waters of the Seine. But the Frankish forces were unprepared for the scale of the Viking assault. On March 28, 845, the siege began. Viking forces, known for their ferocity and discipline, quickly overran the Frankish defenses on the outskirts of the city. They ravaged the countryside, destroying everything in their path. Villages were burned, churches looted, and the people slaughtered. The Viking army advanced without mercy, pressing closer and closer to the gates of Paris. Inside the walls of Paris, chaos reigned. The citizens, gripped by fear, turned to the church for salvation. But the Franks had no choice but to prepare for a final stand. Emperor Charles, unable to gather enough troops to repel the invasion, was forced to make a difficult decision. Faced with a devastating defeat and the possibility of losing his capital, Charles knew that the Frankish army could not match the speed and strength of the Viking forces. Diplomacy, rather than bloodshed, became his weapon of choice. Charles the Bald, rather than risking the complete destruction of Paris, offered a ransom, a massive sum of 7,000 pounds of silver and gold. Ragnar, though eager for battle, knew the value of such wealth. The Vikings agreed, but not before continuing to strike fear into the city's inhabitants, making it clear that Paris was at their mercy. The Vikings sailed away, victorious not through force alone, but through the tribute paid by a king desperate to save his city. The people of Paris would never forget the terror of those days: the sight of Viking longships on the river, the fires that burned across their lands, and the knowledge that they had been powerless to stop them. While the city of Paris would recover and rebuild, the siege of 845 left a lasting legacy. It was a turning point that showed the Franks that their empire was vulnerable to these seafaring warriors. In the years that followed, more Viking raids would come, and the Carolingian rulers would struggle to maintain their authority. As for Ragnar Lothbrok, his legend only grew after the siege of Paris. Some say his victory at Paris cemented his place as one of the greatest Viking leaders, while others claim his story is more myth than fact. But the legacy of the Viking raids on France, and the toll they took on the Frankish kingdom, is undeniable. The Siege of Paris in 845 is significant not just because of the sheer audacity of the Vikings to attack such a key city, but because it represents a moment when the Frankish Empire, once the dominant power in Europe, was forced to negotiate with invaders. The Vikings were no longer just raiders, they were becoming a political and military force to be reckoned with. The Vikings would continue to shape the course of European history for centuries to come, leaving behind both fear and fascination. The Siege of Paris was just one chapter in a much larger story of conquest, culture, and survival. But in 845, for a brief moment, a band of warriors from the north had brought the might of a kingdom to its knees, all for the promise of silver and gold. A moment when legends clashed with kingdoms. The Siege of Paris by Vikings 845. Please subscribe, comment, hit the bell, and share to others.